So I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to be hearing about how a Sacramento-area bike share system has influenced travel behavior. My name is Mike Centetos. I'm a policy director here for our SB1 research program at the UCDAVIS Institute of Transportation Studies. I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. Before we get into the presentation, I want to do just a quick introduction. And Tatsuya, if you want to go ahead and share your slides while I'm starting that, go ahead. This webinar is hosted by the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies. And you can, move to the next slide. Thank you. So UCITS is an expansive network of faculty, research and administrative staff, and students who are dedicated to advancing the state-of-the-art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy to benefit the residents of California, the nation, and the world. UCITS was established by the California legislature in 1947. We have branches at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. If you could move to the next slide, our UCITS statewide transportation research program is supported by the state of California through funding from the Road Repair and Accountability Act as 2017, also known as SB1, and the Public Transportation Account. So today's webinar is going to last 1 hour. It's going to cover findings from a report called How Dockless Electric Bike Share Influences Travel Behavior, Attitudes, Health, and Equity. It's available on the UCITS website. And I'll make sure to put a link to that report in the chat. Following the presentation, we'll hear some reactions from Sabrina Bradbury of the Sacramento-area Council of Governments, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. You can use the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar platform down at the bottom of your screen. Type in your questions at any time, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. We will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on the UCITS website along with the slides. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our presentation. We're first going to be hearing from Dr. Dylan Fitch. He's going to set the stage for this research project. Dylan is the co-director of the Bicycling Plus Research Collaborative at the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies. And then he's going to turn it over to Tatsuya Fukushige to talk about the research findings. And Tatsuya is a PhD candidate at the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies as well. So Dylan, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Tatsuya, can you move it forward? I'm just going to introduce first the Bicycling Plus Research Collaborative because this is a fairly new center that I started in 2019. And so I just want to make everyone aware that all the bike-related and micromobility-related research is posted here. So please visit this site if you want to learn more about all the research being done at UC Davis on these topics. We've kind of grouped them into 6 different themes, but you'll see that as you look for our current research and our past research, it's really quite expansive in terms of the number of disciplines that we cover. Next slide, Tatsuya. Thanks, Mike, for putting up the link. Can we get them? There it goes. So just a couple current projects that are ongoing. There's a lot of work on micromobility. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the e-bike share in the Sacramento region. But there's other projects related to micromobility, such as the North American Micromobility Panel. We have projects on bike safety and leveraging mobility data for improving safety. Also projects on e-bike lending and the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on micromobility. We have also current projects that are building tools to help support walking and bicycling investments as well. And then you'll find those projects on the website, but some of the upcoming projects are not yet there. Tatsuya, next slide. We have some new projects that we're starting to broaden the scope of bicycling research at UC Davis. So we're looking at directly evaluating, for example, e-bike rebate programs, looking at the potential for blending bikes with goods movement research that we have. We have a research center on sustainable freight at UCDAVIS. And then also micromobility for disaster and response and recovery. So kind of new areas that we haven't yet had a chance to research. And then other, bicycling research that's more recreational in nature. So a new project on bicycling in the Yosemite Valley. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about this this research project on e-bike share in the Sacramento region. So this is a study that dates back to 2016 when Professor Susan Handy did a before survey when she thought the bike share was going to arrive soon because there's lots of delays in the bike share in the Sacramento region. And so it's really a 5-year look at the effect of this jump operated electric bike share in the region. And so it includes data of survey residents in the region before and after the bike share launched. It includes surveys of the users of the bike share. And then what we're going to focus on today a little bit, it's the blending of all this survey data with system level attributes of where the bike trips are occurring. And so while this 5-year project has spanned a bunch of different topics, there's the multi-year project in these main phases. The first phase is mostly reported in the year 1 report, which was published last year. And we're going to focus on this phase 2, which is really focused in on the VMT reduction side of things and potential policies and operational characteristics that that can be used to reduce VMT or to increase the effect the bike share has on reducing VMT in the region. And I should say vehicle miles traveled, that's VMT. And then we have an ongoing 3rd phase, which is to look more deeply at segmenting the user side. And so both that's on, how to market the service to increase ridership or other policy and operational strategies, soft strategies to increase ridership. Now, I should say that this work was all done prior to the rise of e-scooters. At one point, there were 100 e-scooters in the system toward the latter end of our project, but the system looks totally different now, right? There's many more scooters than there are e-bikes in the system. So a lot of this work is kind of more generalizable to cities that are either have or looking to have a bike share but don't have scooters. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about the big picture of the project. So I'm going to turn it over to Tatsuya to talk a little bit about the background and the specific research from this phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Okay, so in the rest of our slide, I'm talking about the 2nd phase of our project. So before the emergence of COVID-19, so many cities look to shared micromobility to help improve a lot of urban problems, such as environment and social conditions and public health. And according to NACTO, the number of trips by shared micromobility in US was just 321,000 in 2010, but after just a decade, the number of trips increased to 136 million trips. So this is a huge increase. And this kind of shows the micromobility service was getting popular. And of course, it is intuitive that cities can get such benefit by introducing micromobility service, especially in bike share system. But this assumes that micromobility use replaces the car travel. So if most of the trips made by shared micromobility is shifted from sustainable transportation, the benefits should be limited. And so far, we know a little bit about who substitute micromobility used for car travel. And also, we don't know what types of trips are associated with car substitution. And then it is not clear about how benefit bike share actually bring to the city and the community. So from this motivation, we set a couple of research questions in this project. So firstly, what influenced car substitution compared to other mode substitution? And secondly, how can bike share service reduce car travel? And then how does planning and regulation of bike share system influence car substitution rate and PMT reduction? So basically to answer our research question, we conducted 4 different analyses in this study. The first analysis we did in this project was to identify factors influencing the decision to take bike share trips instead of using other modes. It is important to learn how bike share users, their characteristics and trip attributes influence mode substitution, because it can give us some ideas about designing bike share operation and policies to increase car substitution. And then the second analysis we did was about evaluating how much BMT reduction bike share service made. It is often said that the bike share service brings environmental benefit, but we don't know how much. And as I said, if bike share trips replace other sustainable modes, such as walking, public transit, and bicycling, the effect should be less than what we expect. So applying a series of models to actual trip data, we evaluated an amount of BMT reduction. And then in the third analysis, we developed a model to estimate bike share demand. And also in this process, we also found factors influencing the number of bike share use. And then lastly, based on demand model and other models we built in this project, we conducted a scenario analysis to estimate potential BMT reduction from change to bike share service, such as the expansion of service boundary and change of fleet size. And before I introduce result of each analysis, I briefly mention about what data we used in project. So we mainly used 2 different data sources. One is Jump User Survey. So as Dylan explained in the beginning, the first phase of our project was to conduct survey in 2018 and 2019 spring. And their target was Jump service users in the Sacramento region. I don't explain the detail of the survey here, but basically we collected bike share user attitude and perception and their bike share experience and travel behavior. And another data we used in this project is bike location data. The general bike share feed specification called GBFS offers real-time accessible bike location. So we web scraped the real-time status of bikes in the Sacramento region in 2019 and 2020. And then we converted the data to trip data and then aggregated it for our further analysis. Okay, so analysis 1. So with our survey data, we look at the relationship between mode substitution of bike share trips and various types of factors, such as trip attribute, individual characteristics, with environment, and attitude. So we examine the relationship for non-commute trips and commute trips separately in this project. This is just because of data ability in our survey. And firstly, I introduced our key findings in non-commute trips. So we found some positive factors associated with car substitution. For example, for longer trips, people tend to replace car travel, especially ride hailing. And we also found that women are more likely to substitute bike share for car travel. And some previous studies say that women are less likely to bicycle, so this suggests that bike share has some potential to increase car substitution. But on the other hand, we found that those who use bike share for trips starting from commercial and office area are less likely to use car or ride hailing if a bike share were not available. So this makes sense because most of the commercial area, the office area in the Sacramento is in the dense downtown area, which is relatively walkable. And of course, the downtown has a good access to public transit. And the right figure showed a conditional effect of trip distance and trip purpose on mode substitution, which means that how dominant substitution mode shift by trip purpose and trip distance. And x-axis shows the distance and y-axis shows the share of mode substitution. And as you can see the figure, 1 mile is a kind of changing point for any trip purpose, which means the dominant mode shift from walking to car option. But the exception is a recreational purpose, which shows no trip as a dominant mode for longer trips. So these results suggest bike share service induce some long recreational trips. And next slide shows the result about commute trips. So in the same as non-commute trips, trip distance was positively associated with car substitution. And this figure shows a conditional effect of trip distance and gender on mode substitution, which means that how dominant substitution modes shift by distance and gender. And as you can see, the figure suggests 1 mile is again a key changing point. But the difference between women and other is that for women, dominant mode shift from bicycle to car options for more than 1.5 mile trips, but bicycle remains as a dominant substitution mode of others for even more than 1.5 miles. Okay, so analysis 2. So in this second analysis, we evaluated system-wide BMT reduction from bike share service based on actual trip data in the Sacramento region. So in this estimation, I just want to mention that we considered only about BMT reduction from the car substitution. Car substitution in this project means include a private car and ride-hailing substitution. And of course, reversing and maintenance operation is an important work in bike share system. And the operation is often done by truck, which increase the BMT in the system. But in this analysis, we didn't consider about this effect. So, and this figure is shows a flow of estimating the BMT reduction. I don't explain the detail here, but the idea of the analysis is in the beginning, we applied two-mode substitution model we developed in the previous analysis to trip data to predict substituted mode. But the problem of this approach is that we get two different predicted substitution mode for each trip data. So for this issue, we weighted the output with the share of non-commute trips and commute trips in sake of regional household travel survey. And also, we don't know the potential driving distance for each trip data if bike share was not available. So we developed another model to predict the driving distance. And based on such output, we estimated the system-wide BMT reduction. And some studies say like mode substitution from ride-hailing not only reduced actual driving distance, but also reduce deadheading and searching. So deadheading is a distance for a driver traveling to pick up a passenger, and searching is a distance for driver driving for next passenger. So based on some previous study, we also weighted the output predicted as ride-hailing mode to include the potential reduction in deadheading and searching. Okay. Next, the figure. So right figure shows the estimated share of substitution mode on weekday and weekend we did. So as you can see, our results show that nearly 40% of all bike share trips were shifted from car travel, including private car, carpooling, and ride-hailing. And walking is a dominant substitution mode, which represents nearly 30% of all bike share trips. And our result also shows that 6 to 7% of all trips were induced by bike share service. So this indicates that bike share service may promote some physical activity and vitalize the local economy. And we also found that carpooling and no trip had a higher share on weekends than on weekdays. But this result is intuitive since people tend to be more flexible in their activity on weekend. And the next slide shows the result of system-wide BMT reduction in Sacramento. And bike share system in Sacramento, the operator made service change in June 2019, such as increase of bike fleet and expansion of the service boundary. So such change would influence BMT reduction. So we estimated BMT reduction before and after the service change. And as you can see the figure, BMT reduction from bike share service increased after the service change. Before the service change, the number of active fleet per day was about 650 bikes. And the BMT reduction per day was about 1795 miles. But after the service change, the fleet size increased to 750 active bikes, and BMT reduction per day also increased to 2,160 miles. So this means each bike reduced users' BMT by an average of 2.8 miles per day for both before and after the service change. Okay, analysis 3. So in the third analysis, we develop a model to estimate bike share demand and to examine factors influencing bike share use. So in our modeling process, we found some interesting relationship between factors and bike share demand. So for example, we found that fleet size is positively associated with the demand. This makes sense because higher density means a higher probability of finding bikes within a walkable distance. But of course, this effect per bike will decrease as fleet size increase. And we also found that trips between commercial and office areas or between industrial areas are more frequent than as a combination of areas. And in terms of equity, areas with a higher proportion of low-income households tend to have less bike share use. But this result does not mean that low-income people are less likely to use bike share service. This result just shows a few trips starting or ending in such areas. So we need to have further analysis for this issue. And our result also shows that university is one popular place to generate bike share use on weekdays. Okay, so analysis 4. This is the last analysis. So we conducted a scenario analysis to understand how BMT reduction changed if the service was changed. About the service change, we focused on service area and fleet size. So first of all, I explain what areas we examine and what scenario we made. And the left figure shows the service boundary we examine. And red boundary shows the actual service boundary. And left side is the city of Davis, and the right side of red boundary is part of Sacramento and West Sacramento. And blue boundary shows the boundary we draw to learn the effect of the service change or the bike share demand and BMT reduction. And small blue boundary in the red boundary nearly covers downtown Sacramento. We set this small boundary because we wanted to examine how a service boundary with only commercial and office area influence service efficiency. And also we set a larger boundary, including more residential area than the original service boundary. And we also set the boundary in Woodland, which is the size of the area is similar to the city of Davis, but one big difference is no large university in Woodland. And in terms of fleet size, we set 5 different fleet size density for each area. And this is a flow to estimate BMT reduction in our scenario analysis. The idea of the method is similar to what I explained in the analysis 2, but the one big difference is what demand data we use. So in the previous analysis, we use actual trip data. So we basically simply apply two-mode substitution model to trip data. However, in our scenario analysis, we deal with areas where bike share was not offered. Also, we need to estimate the number of bike share trips if the fleet size increase or decrease. So we generated synthesized trip data based on the demand model in the analysis 3. And this is a result of predicting system-wide demand. And left figure shows the estimated demand for each scenario. Our analysis shows that increase of fleet size also increase the total demand. So in downtown Sacramento, with 17.5 bikes per square mile, the mean of predicted demand is around 1,300 trips per day. But in the original Sacramento service boundary, the demand increased to 2,700 trips. And in the expanded boundary, the number increased even more to about 3,400 trips. And very interesting is the size of area in downtown Sacramento is much smaller than Davis, but estimated demand is similar. And also our results show that Woodland has a quite low expected demand. Also, the size of area is similar to the city of Davis. So this would be probably because of no busy location generating the bike share demand, such as a large commercial area or large university. And right figure shows the bike efficiency, which means the number of trips per bike per day for each scenario. And the result is intuitive. Basically, the figure shows that expanding the service boundary or increase the fleet density, decrease the service efficiency. And next, I show you our result of predicted system-wide BMT reduction. So it is no surprise that increase of fleet size increase BMT reduction because the demand also increase, of course. And in the original Sacramento service boundary, if the bike density is 12.5 bikes per square mile, a total amount of BMT reduction would be 1,750 miles. And if the density is 22.5 bikes per mile, the reduction goes up to about 2,300 miles. And even adding deadheading and searching, even inflate to 2,300 miles for case with a 12.5 bike per square mile, and also 3,000 miles for 22.5 bike per square mile case. And in our simulation, the demand in downtown in Davis is similar, but BMT reduction in Davis is higher than in downtown. This would be probably because in a mode substitution model, those who start from commercial and office area tend to substitute their bike share for non-car option. And also smaller area cannot have long trips, so which means less car substitution. So we think that's why we got this result. So conclusion. So in our phase 2 project, so we conducted 4 different analyses, and overall, our results say that bike share service would bring some BMT reduction and also induce some trips, which eventually increase physical activity and vitalize local community. And we found that in our analysis that expanding the bike share service boundary at the same field density decreased system efficiency and BMT reduction per bike. And our model also shows that expanding the existing Sacramento service boundary and maintaining the same field density will result in more bike share trips and more BMT reduction. But still the service efficiency would drop. So this result means that suggests the potential trade-off between public policy objective and operational concern. And also results say that service boundary has to be drawn the line carefully because our results show that presence of popular POI within the service boundary, such as downtown area and university, change the bike use and service efficiency significantly. So, which means this influences the sustainable operation a lot. And also, as I mentioned before, we found that bike share is more likely to substitute for car travel for longer trips and also trips starting in non-commercial areas. So this suggests that if the policy goal is only BMT reduction, in that case, rebalancing policy should consider providing more bikes in such areas where we can expect more BMT reduction. And also our findings that the big difference in bike share use on weekdays and weekends in areas with university suggests the need for an efficient rebalancing strategy or requirement. So that's all of my phase presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tatsuya. Really interesting insights there in terms of what bike share trips are replacing in terms of other modes, and actually being able to quantify or estimate a number for VMT reduction that can be attributed to bike share. So appreciate you sharing those insights. So we're now going to turn to our guest respondent, who we're really excited to have. Sabrina Bradbury is the Senior Program Manager at the Sacramento-area Council of Governments, where she manages SACOG's Regional Bike Share Project. And Sabrina, we'd love to hear your reactions to this work, questions you have, and maybe kind of just how SACOG is thinking about some of these issues.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Tatsuya and Dylan, for doing this research. It's very interesting to us. Obviously, we're always looking to improve the bike share system in our region, and it's exciting to have some data that is not just national level or big city, but actually specific to our region and the use that we've seen here. And as you noted in some of the ridership levels, we actually were the second top market that Jump had globally, coming in only after Paris in terms of total trips that were taken in our region. So we knew the ridership was strong, but to be able to quantify the trip reduction that's associated with that is really exciting and makes it easier for us to make the case for the great VMT and greenhouse gas reductions that we're seeing from bike share and the potential to expand that and do even more with the system. So thank you for doing that research and having me here. I do have a few different questions I wanted to touch on. And one is that we are working on relaunching bike share in the city of Davis and the UCDAVIS. And we've been talking a lot about having a much bigger bike fleet than even originally launched in that area. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how the modeling work that you've done could help us plan for that in terms of what the best fleet size might be for that area in terms of creating a reliable, equitable option for people to get around both on campus and downtown, but also connecting to transit.
Great question. I guess I'll jump in first and then I'll let Tatsuya add to it. So yes, we think our model can be used specifically in this region to help improve those parameters, the number of bikes, the geographic reach, which are the two key parameters that we were playing with in this study. The real challenge, though, will be one, predicting the demand outside of the bounds of our data. So because we only have data for a limited supply of bikes in the past, it's hard to know exactly if we're predict how much demand would increase if we add, say double the bikes. We can still, our model will still produce results. It's just hard to know if they're going to be very accurate. And then the other thing I would say is that if the system, so for example, in Davis, we think in 2019 when there were e-bikes here, it was very supply constrained. And when we asked people in the campus travel survey how frequently they were looking for a bike in the bike share and they couldn't find one, it was 70% of respondents said that occurred to them. And then through some back of the envelope calculations, we estimated that nearly half of the demand for bike share couldn't be met by the 150 to 170 bikes that were in Davis at the time. So all of the behavioral patterns that we have from Davis in a supply constrained environment may be quite different if all of a sudden the system it's not supply constrained and there are bikes everywhere and people can choose them, when and where they need them. So yeah, that's my general answer. Tetsuya, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, so yeah, as Dylan mentioned, we estimate such result. I mean, we try to run the model with higher bike density, but of course, as he said, our model doesn't cover such a high fleet density. So our results say that if the fleet size is double, the number of trips increase 1.6 times more than previous demand. But campus traveler also said, as he said, we students still, I think the UCD affiliates think we need more bikes. So, and if also I'm a jump bike user, and from my experience, yes, when I want to use in the midday in the residential area, no bike around our house, so it is difficult to use the jump bike frequently, and also the service is not reliable, so I cannot set my schedule based on the jump service. So yeah, if we could have the more fleet in Davis, definitely everyone would be happy for that.
So maybe this is all just directing us to the idea that our model could be useful not only in the Sacramento region, but other regions to start to think about these issues, but really experimentation needs to happen on the ground in order to know for sure what are the supply, like how many bikes are really needed. So yeah.
Sabrina, I think you may have more questions, but I wonder if I could cut in and just ask a more general question for all of you about this. I mean, you in the study looked at this measure of efficiency, right? Of how many trips per bike per day, and what happens to that number as you add more bikes and the efficiency goes down. I'm just curious for all of your perspectives on how important that efficiency metric is. If you're adding more bikes and they're resulting in more trips and more VMT reduction, but the total number of uses of each bike is less, you know, is that something important to pay attention to or not?
Well, I think the operators are very in tune to that because that's probably a really important metric for them to make money. At the same time, it's probably more complicated than just they're not trying to maximize the trips per bikes per se, because of course they need to rebalance the fleet, they need to charge the fleet, and so there probably are some operational sweet spots that they're aiming for. But I think, so I guess the efficiency, the reason why we marked that efficiency is just to get a general idea of how, of usage per bike. It's actually not, like you were just mentioned, Mike, it's not all that important for VMT reduction. We want to just see more VMT being reduced. So more trips, more VMT. But eventually it's going to come down to how cost effective that is as a strategy to reduce VMT.
Yeah, I think that's right on point. And when we did research when we did our business plan prior to launching the system at all, it was based on pedal bikes, not e-bikes, but we had estimated that at somewhere around 1 trip per bike per day was going to be pretty good, and 2 trips per bike per day, we were, you know, going to be coming in above where we needed to in terms of revenue. But that does change a little bit with e-bikes, and an operator wouldn't want an e-bike sitting somewhere and not getting used for days, and the battery dies on its own, and then they got to go get it anyway. So there is some balancing act, but I think that, as Dylan said, achieving 5 or 6 trips per bike per day, I don't think is something that has to be achieved in order to have a financially sustainable system.
Sure. Well, sorry to interrupt your comments, Sabrina. Please, if you had.
No, that was on my mind as well. And similar question that I found it really interesting that you looked at Woodland, particularly because we do have a lot of suburban cities in our region who've expressed interest in wanting shared micromobility. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, it sounded like it was the land use piece that impacted what the ridership would be in that scenario. Is that right?
Right. So the demand model that we used included land use and sociodemographics from census data as predictors of demand. So that's all we have to go on in Woodland, because we didn't have any bike share data in Woodland. So those are the 2 key things that suggest, I mean, the real big effect, like Tatsuya mentioned, was the fact that there's a really strong effect for these near universities or big commercial areas. So those land uses produce a lot of demand, at least in the region. So because Woodland doesn't have that, our models didn't produce as much demand. But again, experimentation is needed, right? We don't have bike share in Woodland, and so we're not really sure if we can extrapolate from, Sacramento to Woodland.
Yeah, that I agree 100%. Definitely, pilots are a completely different way of testing that's gets you a firm answer. I think the ridership in our region was much higher than we ever predicted it would be. So there could be untapped demand in Woodland and other cities as well. Sorry, Mike, just one more question and then can turn it over to folks in the audience. But I wanted to talk a little bit about equity and balancing policy objectives with the financial side of making these systems pencil for operators. And as you mentioned, Dylan, the need for some kind of higher use areas like a downtown or university. And curious if you have recommendations for folks that are planning their systems on how to create a system that serves low-income BIPOC communities, but how do you make it so that it incorporates all those different users? Are there some tips that you have for how you might plan your service area and fleet sizes?
Sure, yeah. So in year one, we looked a little bit about on the usage of in the regions, and especially in what Tatsuya just showed is that service change that occurred in 2019 was incorporated more disadvantaged communities, and it required fleet rebalancing to those communities. And we saw increases in ridership, increases in VMT reduction. Maybe they weren't one-to-one, so the efficiency declined a little bit. But I think probably the work that's more important to answer the question that you just asked is work from my other colleagues there at UCDAVIS that are doing, real deep research on what it takes to build, to build an equity program in something like a micromobility service. And I think the key things that come out of that research are heavy involvement from the get-go. There are examples that we've heard where a business wasn't even informed of a bike share hub that was going to be parked right in front of their business. And, they're not going to support a bike share, and maybe their clientele aren't going to support a bike share if they feel like they were involved in the process of it, even if, the planning community thinks this is a way to reduce VMT and it's this global, this is a great thing. They're bikes, right? Anyone, especially we have incentive programs that can reduce the cost for low-income residents. These are all great things, but if you don't involve people in the communities that this is going to be, impacting, then it's going to be hard to be, successfully improve equity. So it's not really part of our study, but I think there's some great research coming out of UCDAVIS on this topic.
Well, we've got a lot of great questions coming in, and maybe we can start with just a little more context for you, Sabrina. Could you, just about the bike share system, can you talk about how the system is currently funded, and whether they're, like, for example, are there developer fees that are contributing to funding the bike share network or the bike share system, or just where the funding is coming from, or has come from? Yes.
Yeah, so the funding for the project, before launching, we received a grant of congestion mitigation air quality funds that was part of a SACOG funding round. And those funds were used to procure the original system, do a lot of planning around where hubs and station parking would be installed. And we purchased a lot of bike parking that was installed across all 3 cities. And then the operations themselves, it ended up being a bit of a transition where we were initially planning to purchase the bikes and then contract with an operator to operate the system. But we ended up not purchasing the bikes, and Jump, who ended up being operated by Uber, they were paying for all of the operations. And then since then, the pandemic hit, the fleet was pulled by Uber, and there was a transition, a handoff from Uber to Lime as the operator. And the economics for bike share had just changed a lot since we had originally launched. And it is, I would say, across all systems, even if they're publicly owned and operated, there's some level of subsidy coming in the form of sponsorships or fees for, for cities paying towards the system. And so we did negotiate a deal with Lime to relaunch bikes with a monthly subsidy that's based on the trips per bike per day and how many bikes are out on the system. And that subsidy is being paid with local funds from the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you. So we've gotten several questions, and Dylan, I know you were just saying experimentation is needed, but we've gotten several questions kind of asking about how we might extrapolate these results and what lessons we might learn for other areas. And so, a question about whether you saw seasonal variation in the use of the bike share system and whether you might see kind of similar usage or VMT reduction in an area with, say, poor winter weather that might discourage biking, or whether you might see similar levels of VMT reduction with a bike share system that are not e-bikes, but rather are pedal bikes. So I don't know if you or Tatsuya would want to make any general comments about how these data might be applicable in other areas.
Well, I'll let Tatsuya say something about the specific data, but first, generally, I would say, well, yes, and it's well known across bike share research and bicycling research that weather is a big determinant of use. When we had the smoke, for example, in our region, we just saw bike share plummet to next to no use. So yes, you have to care if we want to estimate, for example, like annual reductions in VMT, then we'd have to be careful about seasonality. In our case, we were, I can't remember which month we picked it was probably a fall month or something kind of in the middle. But then Mike, you had another question about the pedal bike versus, or the conventional bike versus the e-bike. And I think it really depends on the context, because there's some great evidence of docked conventional bike share having some pretty large car substitution effects, especially if you consider they're connecting to transit. But in the broader bicycling literature, e-bikes do substitute more car travel in general. That usually from owned e-bikes though. But I suspect that e-bikes do substitute more car travel, and I don't know how much more in a bike share, but I would suspect it's going to be more. So Tatsuya, do you want to say something more specific about our project? And
yeah, because we use the data in the good season, as you said, we use the data in October and November without non-rainy day. So basically, our model can estimate the reasonable demand in the good season, but for winter, obviously the demand drops, so it is questionable to apply our model to define the season. But at least our model is a kind of example to estimate the VMT reduction. So in that way, our model can be applicable to other area, but still need to collect the data and do everything again. So yeah.
Well, we have gotten a couple of folks weighing in the chat that are interested in connecting with you both about whether this could be applied to other areas. So we'll make sure to capture that for you. And thanks to those individuals for reaching out. We got a question about the importance of infrastructure, bike lanes, safe places to ride bikes. So I'd open that to all of you to just talk about kind of this trade-off, right, of funding the bike share system versus funding the infrastructure, and how important the infrastructure is to encouraging bike share use, and just kind of how those two are interconnected.
Yes, infrastructure is important. Bicycling scholarship, I mean, it's intuitive, and the research shows that it's really, really important for encouraging bicycling. Interestingly, in our study, we have these kind of two key environments that are quite different. So Davis, which you might call the most bike-friendly place in the country, and Sacramento, which actually at the time of launching bike share, you know, how many protected bike lanes were there? Not very many. It's much more, shared use roads, a lot more traffic, a lot of higher speeding traffic. Since during the bike share in Sacramento, a lot of new bike infrastructure was placed in Sacramento. So it kind of went through this transformation, and it's still going through it. But Davis is this control case that really not much has changed. It's been a great place to ride a bike. And interestingly, we saw, like as Tetsuya showed, similar demand in downtown Sacramento and in Davis. They're totally different contexts, different infrastructure, and yet the people are demanding the bikes, or they wanted to use the bikes in both areas. So I would just caution that I think that we need it all. I think that in terms of cost effectiveness, I'm working on that. We have a project to look at the costs and benefits of all types of interventions for walking and bicycling. And so I'm not really sure about the cost effectiveness, but I do think that while infrastructure is definitely needed, there are ways to fund that. But I don't think we should, rule out something like a bike share because it's probably, has synergy with infrastructure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that I think, as Dylan alluded to, a lot of times these devices can spur investments and speed them up that might otherwise have lagged behind, in terms of what we saw with Sacramento coming out with protected bike lanes. I think it made it clear that there was a lot of demand for bicycling that no one really knew was there until we had bike share in the region. And so I think that has helped bring more attention to it as a mode of transportation that signals to policymakers that we need to be investing in bikeways, protected bikeways, bike lanes, all of that infrastructure, parking, so that it is a real option for people that they feel safe choosing over a car.
Great. Well, there are a couple other questions that I really wanted to get to, and I apologize that we've run out of time, as we always seem to do. So thank you to everyone for asking such good questions. Thank you so much to our presenters and to Sabrina for joining us and offering your insights. Tatsuya, if you could advance just to the next slide, and just in our last 30 seconds here, I did want to pitch that the UC Institute of Transportation Studies has another webinar coming up later this month on the impacts of COVID-19 on e-commerce and last mile delivery. So you can go to ucits.org for more information on that webinar. And I will, I won't have time to put that on the chat, but hopefully you all can make it there. And just once again, a big thank you to our presenters and to our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, reach out to us if you have any further questions.